So if material comes in a license that says you can use this, but only as it is, you cannot change it. And our licenses don't allow you to change it. So some people, you know, in a copyright law, it would be some rights reserved perhaps, but this is a more free license. So Jeff and I could write an article and say, or a book, which we've talked about this morning, but we could write something and say, you can share this, you can distribute it any way you want, you can't alter the text. Or we could do it in a more free form and allow people to, you know, mash it up, cut it into parts, etc. Are there any questions on this before we?
So far.
So far, we like acronyms.
And they're not even nice, easily pronounceable acronyms either. OA doesn't say anything.
Are we going to get to the open glam?
Yeah, we'll get to open glam in a second. I wanted to make a note of this. The NIH adopted they're calling it a public access policy, but really it's an open access statement I think it was in 2008, where the policy is any publication that comes out of research funded by the NIH must go into the NIH's repository after, I believe, a year, is it? And the repository is an open repository. I don't believe that there's much in the way of enforcement teeth, which is to say I don't think the NIH is going to come knocking down your door if you don't deposit.
They are.
Are they now?
Oh, yeah.
They weren't for a while.
No,
Okay. That's good, actually. I think that's good.
They were for a while. Now if you come back as a PI and you have a list of pubs that came out of your research, if they're not in PubMed Central, you will not get funding. In fact, the letter even says that your funding could be terminated if you don't get them in there.
See, now that's what I call enforcement teeth. That's good. Okay. Yeah, for a while, I suppose it took them a while to ramp up to that. And now there was a White House memo last year that was directed at, I mean, they didn't say this explicitly, but of course it was directed at the National Institute of Health and the NSF and the big funding agencies that essentially said, you know, thou shalt do the same kind of thing that the NIH did. So this is gaining some traction for federally funded research, and of course this has been an argument in the open access world all along, that publications from research funded by federal money should be treated like any government publication, which of course are not copyrightable anyway. And now Open Glam, right, which is a kind of a horrible acronym, but there it is. Galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. I think it's amusing that galleries has its own, anyway, never mind that. But the idea is that these public institutions, these cultural heritage institutions, are pushing on the same direction of opening content that, you know, support the advance of humanities knowledge, right? That it ends with institutions that take steps to open their collections, and they specifically single out metadata, will benefit from that openness, right? So it's very much in line with the federal government's open policies, just for a different set of institutions.
I never thought I never used the word open glam in presentation.
Honestly, I think David Bowie every time I hear that. That's just me with the thing.
I get used to it. I mean, I get used to Web 2.0. I mean,
what I find really interesting though is that a lot of these policies start out, as the open plan principles do, with metadata. That seems to be a less controversial position to take that the metadata is somehow less problematic to open access to than the content that that metadata points to, which we could get into a whole discussion about the distinction between metadata and data. And in light of the NSA phone metadata issues, we can get into a whole discussion about whether or not metadata really is not unproblematic, but those are separate conversations. These policies tend to start with metadata and go from there, interestingly.
So in a way, the DPLA could serve as a guiding light to help bring all these pieces together instead of operating independently, which is probably the big step. And I don't know how, I really don't understand how galleries got in there, but.
They wanted to make the case that they're not museums.
Right, yeah.
It was for the acronym.
Of course, because LAM doesn't,
Yeah, it's not exist.
Yeah.
I wonder if they could copyright open LAM now.
Oh, too bad. Yeah.
Okay, so as a guiding light, when we're thinking about the DPLA, we are thinking about archives and we are thinking about museums, and these are in there. John Palfrey, who is really considered to be the parent of the DPLA project, had envisioned Scanobagos. Winnebago's outfitted to scan things, and Candy Schwartz, who's a professor here, had already volunteered to be running around the country with the Scanobagos, putting it in there, but the folks at Harvard said, not while you're funding under us, you're not going to have Scanobagos.
Because here's the problem, fundamentally, right? Setting up a digital production initiative is really pricey, right? It requires a huge amount of hardware, it requires staffing time, it's an expensive proposition to set up a digitization initiative. So, institutions of the size of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, or Duke just down the road, we can set these up in the libraries because we're relatively well funded, we have the resources and whatnot, but much smaller institutions can't. Public libraries, in particular, just don't have that kind of, I don't want to say disposable income, but essentially, surplus to set up a whole initiative. And so you get things like the Mountain West Digital Library Consortium, where you get, entire states pooling resources. But the idea of the Scanobagos was another solution to that problem, right? You have a collection that you want to digitize and, do all of this production. We'll send a Winnebago to you, right? And it would be staffed with, eager young volunteers who were going to scan the heck out of your stuff and do all of the production. And these Winnebagos would be hollowed out, and you'd have essentially an entire production suite on the inside. And if you ever get a chance to see the blueprints for these, they're really cool. But that was the idea of the Scanabago, and it actually was, I thought, a really nice kind of elegant solution to this particular problem that completely failed to take off.
No, now the DPLA is independent if they can get the funding, sure. So that could be Candy's sabbatical project someday.
That would be great. I could see Candy doing that.
She doesn't drive, but she would have a scans of interns. So.
That's right.
Yeah.
Someone to chauffeur.
So that would be the vision. Is the vision thing. So here in New England, it makes more sense sometimes than to think about it from my background in California, because you have so many little collections. You have small house museum archives and materials that really could come out of the closet, so to speak, if we come up with a way to envision how that might work.
Yeah, and this is something that I think the DPLA has been looking to Europeana on for some time now. That, I mean, of course, Europeana has the participation of things like the Louvre, right? Which, you know, nobody needs, you know, to be told about that. But there are lots of smaller institutions whose collections you may not be familiar with, which are now on par with the Louvre and the British Library, right? Because it really doesn't matter that these are at a smaller institution, that if you search for whatever you search for, you're going to get metadata records from all of these institutions. And I think the DPLA is really looking to that model because in North Carolina, a few years ago, we had a project out of the state library that surveyed, it was called NC Echo, I think. Was a project to survey all cultural heritage institutions in the entire state of North Carolina. I'd love to see this done nationwide. And they identified every single thing that could even arguably be called a cultural heritage institution. The toilet museum. I'm not kidding, there really was one. And it was something like 600 institutions, some of which were like, you know, a couple in their backyard who just happened to be collecting, you know, model trains or something. So, you know, imagine if the most esoteric possible resources could be on par with, you know, the most high visibility institution. The problem, I think, for this question comes not so much with the smaller institutions, but with the larger institutions. I mean, you know, the mom and pop cultural heritage institution, I think, probably would welcome the opportunity for somebody to make digital representations of their stuff and open it up and gain a little publicity. I suspect the open access argument wouldn't be a hard sell for those cases. I think the harder sell is with the larger institutions that have more of a weight of history behind them. I suspect.
Well, it is a, you know, it's also what the expectation is. You know, if you look at the words, the DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America, I can tell you from in my experience with the DPLA project, coming up with naming it was painful. I mean, every single word, you know, in there was scrutinized by someone. Even the word America. Are you talking about North America, South America, both? You know, the public part, the library part. Well, it's the archives. If it's glam, you know, then it's more than just a library. So with that said, what are the expectations of what people expect to be in a digital public library of America? So I've been in sessions and someone will say, does that mean that you're going to have access to the best sellers? And is that going to be part of your mission and your charge? And no, that's not going to be a happening thing. I don't see HarperCollins, you know. Sure, you know, you're going to make those materials open access. And we completely understand in the open access community, not everything is going to be open access.
Well, but that then raises the question of why not, right? I mean, is that a principled decision? We will not be dealing with content of X type, in which case you have to scope the DPLA appropriately that that stuff is excluded. Or is it just pragmatically, we're not there yet, and maybe in 25 years after HarperCollins folds, you know, we'll get that stuff, right? So, you know, that's an important distinction, and I don't think we're there yet.
No, we're not there yet. I mean, some of the other content hubs include the Internet Archive, and the Internet Archive is scanning in books that are out of copyright on their own, but it's, you know, again, it's out of copyright or out of, you know, what is out of known copyright.
Right.
Copyright is always...
No known copyright restrictions.
And, you know, is this an orphaned work? when, you know, who was the author, when did this happen, blah, blah, blah. So,
So anyway. So back to the beginning. The driving questions of the session tomorrow were that, and so what we're planning on doing at the DPLA tomorrow that we want to do here too is address this, right? What is the intersection between the open access and open all of these other things, movements, and digital library development? And now that the DPLA has already got a set of policies that say our metadata is contributed to the public domain, how do we push on that to get the partner institutions to be willing and able, as a production issue, to contribute more of the content, not just the metadata records, but the actual content, to openly, right? So we're taking this to the DPLA Fest to say, look, you've already bought into this in principle, now what more can we do? Go. Right? To kind of get them a little bit of awareness raising, but also a little bit of brainstorming.
and it also seems appropriate that DPLA is launched during Open Access Week, which
Was that a deliberate thing, or was it an accident?
I don't think it was.
It wasn't an accident.
I don't think it was an accident.
Then we have to talk about Open Access Week tomorrow. I don't know why I didn't put that in. We need to talk about Open Access Week tomorrow.
Oh, okay. I mean, that was part of the reason that
Yeah.
we put the thing in because it was Open Access Week.
Right, but I look at the agenda though, and there isn't anything about Open
Open
Access
Access
Week specifically,
Okay,
right?
we'll fix that.
Anyway, sorry.
Okay, Open Access
Sorry.
Week. Open Access Week in a nutshell started off as Open Access Day, and it's, sorry, it did.
And it's opening up.
It's opening up.
It'll be Open Access here next.
There was a discussion about making it open month, because the OER folks and other people, it got so crowded last year that we were openly exhausted by the end of it. But Open Access Week was started to not only gain awareness, to increase awareness, but to kind of give us a focal point for all of these separate movements. Unlike other organizations, we do not have a central organizational hub. We are a lot of organizations or a lot of people working together, but there's no single body in charge of this. Which is part of the reason it's so open.
Right. Which is a blessing and a curse, of course, right? Lack of centralized governance.
It's the open mess theory.
Yeah.
So are there any questions or any discussion?
And anything you would like to contribute to this, because we want to hear it. Yeah.
The question is pretty basic, but
Yeah.
about the principle of free to alter text. So I'm sure the text has author attribution.
Yes.
So when someone alters it, does it give the attribute to the original authors and say modified by? It wouldn't be very fair if they took someone else's text and changed it, and somehow didn't make that clear that it wasn't the original words of the primary authors. How does that work?
Yeah, not all of the Creative Commons licenses require attribution. The public domain one, for example, doesn't. I mean, it's generally considered polite to attribute, but if the license doesn't specifically specify, then yeah, you can change the wording and not attribute it if the license doesn't say. But if there is an attribution license, then yeah, you need to say something along the lines of, and I believe the Creative Commons has some boilerplate text that you can use, original text by whatever, modified by, yeah.
Okay.
Also,
I'm sorry, just like a question. Has the DPLA thought about approaching Google for funding for such content?
Google's is part of the.
They are,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure how much they're funding, but they're certainly working with. But,
Even Microsoft.
yeah. Well, but I mean, what's interesting is that, at least on the metadata front, right? I mean, Google and Microsoft and Yahoo are all participating in schema.org, of course, right? Which is like the only thing that Google and Microsoft will ever collaborate on until the end of the universe. But you know, it's kind of a clear signal, right, that they're recognizing that some types of open resources are in their interest, right? And you know, Google Books met with such a backlash that I think Google recognizes that while this is perhaps in their business interest to do this kind of work, they may need to take a different approach than doing it themselves. And they are starting to scale down on Google Books production a bit. Not that that project is likely to stop anytime real soon, but I don't know, I'm speculating here, but I suspect that they're seeking alternate ways of doing this kind of work by working with partners like the DPLA. But that doesn't necessarily mean money.
In some ways, the money is a factor, but I think the DPLA offers the independence that one organization or one company can't have. So it allows for the freedom of the content hubs and the contributors and so forth. So Google's obviously, embraced it with Google Books, but everyone said, oh my God, you can't have all, you have all the content, in one organization. So that was definitely a lesson learned. And, in 2020 hindsight, Google was, and after we do the books, we're going to go and do all the special collections, and we're going to go after all of this other stuff. But what they're looking for is to scan to get the index files.
Right.
They're not scanning as a maintainer of content. They just wanted the index stream so that they could search for it. And that's this is also true for Google Scholar and the other Google project.
Right, but what I find interesting is that Google has kind of given a kick in the seat of the pants to a lot of this library and archive work. I mean, you get the Happy Trust evolving out of the Google Books project, which would probably never have existed without the Google Books project. I mean, and now the Happy Trust is a huge big deal, and there's some really great resources and doing some good development work. And I mean, the DPLA to a certain extent owes its life to the Google Books project because Europeana was not 100%, but in some ways a direct backlash against Google Books project. Right? Because the reaction on the European side to the Google Books project was very negative. Right? You American imperialists, you're going to try to own the cultural heritage of Europe. You can't do that, you American company, right?
Yeah.
So the Europeans got all hacked off and decided to do it themselves. And thus, that's not all of the origin story of Europeana, but it's a chunk of it, right? And the DPLA kind of followed end to end. It's looking to Europeana as kind of a model for operations to a certain extent. So,
And we also have some, we have interesting dances just between nations on the open access